The moment the executors opened Queen Elizabeth's private notes, the room changed forever. What had been expected to be a quiet administrative review became a royal shockwave. Harry's name was not where he believed it would be. William's was. Alone. And with one sentence from the late monarch's own hand, a door Harry thought still existed was suddenly, brutally, and publicly closed. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Silence settled over the room before anyone dared to breathe too loudly. The executors, the trusted legal figures responsible for carrying out the Queen's private wishes after her death, had not arrived to create drama. They had arrived to read what she had left behind. Yet the moment her notes were opened, formality gave way to something colder. The papers on the polished table were not just papers anymore. They became a boundary. They became proof. They became the final voice of a woman who had ruled with patience, watched her family fracture with pain, and chosen, in the end, to place one name above every other. William did not move when his name was read. The prince kept his shoulders still, but the weight of the sentence passed through him like a sentence he had never asked to hear. He had been named alone as the authorized family representative over a sealed set of final instructions, meaning he alone could act for the family in that specific matter. Harry was formally barred from accessing them. Not delayed, not asked to wait. Barred. That single word carried the force of rejection, because it did not come from a hostile courtier or a palace advisor. It came from the Queen's own private hand. Harry received the news through official channels, and for a moment, he said nothing. The silence was not calm. It was shock, wearing a mask. He had faced distance before, endured criticism before, even lived with the ache of separation before, but this cut differently. This came from the grandmother he once believed saw past every headline and every mistake. Somewhere between memory and authority, her affection had been separated from trust, and Harry felt the difference immediately. Charles set down his glasses and refused to speak. The king understood what that silence meant. This was no clerical mistake, no soft palace interpretation, no wording that could be massaged into comfort. The note did not merely favor William, it excluded everyone else. And that precision created the question no one in the room could escape. What had Elizabeth seen before her death that made her write William's name alone? But before the palace could understand the force of the decision, everyone inside it had to face the people wounded most by the Queen's final choice. For Harry, the news struck like a second exile. For William, it landed like a crown made of stone. Two brothers, once protected by the same grandmother, now stood on opposite sides of her final written judgment. One was barred from the room. The other was named as its guardian. And between them stood the memory of a woman neither could bear to lose again. Harry gripped the edge of the table when the words finally reached him, and for a moment, the anger did not come. Only humiliation. Only the slow, crushing realization that this was not a palace delay, not a cold tactic from advisors, not another door held shut by people he could challenge. This came from Elizabeth's private instructions, the written wishes she left behind to guide what should happen after her death. To be denied access was painful enough. To be denied trust was worse. Harry could fight men in suits. He could reject statements and question procedures. But he could not easily fight the handwriting of the grandmother, who had once made him feel safe when the rest of the world felt impossible. William carried the same news differently, but not lightly. The prince stood as the named custodian, the person trusted to guard and follow those instructions. And that role gave him authority without comfort. A custodian, in plain terms, is the person responsible for protecting something important and making sure it is handled exactly as intended. For William, that meant obedience. Not triumph, not revenge, not a chance to prove he had won the long, bitter distance between brothers. He spoke carefully to Charles, choosing every word as if one wrong sentence could deepen the wound. He admitted he had not asked to be placed in this position. He could not soften what Elizabeth had made explicit. Charles listened as a father and as king, and the two roles pulled him in opposite directions. He wanted to see Harry as a wounded son, not as a problem to be managed. Yet he also knew the authority of the late monarch could not be treated like a suggestion. The Queen's private note placed him in an impossible corner. If he defended Harry, he weakened Elizabeth's final command. If he defended the note, he watched his younger son feel cast out again. Charles understood then that this was not just a family argument. It was a test of whether grief could overrule duty. Camilla watched the tension with unease, and she understood what others were only beginning to feel. Elizabeth's instruction had shifted moral power toward William in a way no one could easily reverse. The prince was no longer simply the heir waiting for his time. He had become the guardian of the Queen's final confidence, while Harry stood outside it, wounded by the very person he most wanted to believe, still saw him clearly. And in that painful divide, one question began to rise above every other. What had happened before Elizabeth died that made her draw the line so firmly? And to understand why the Queen wrote with such finality, the story must return to the private incident that turned concern into decision. Long before the executors spoke, there was one evening no one inside the family could erase. It was not a ceremony, not a public scandal, not a headline. It was a private conversation behind closed doors at Windsor, when Elizabeth listened, watched, and finally understood that the future of her final instructions could not be left open to emotion, pressure, or fractured loyalties. That evening began with a memorial plan, but it ended with a fracture no one could repair. The Windsor Library conversation, as those closest to the family later called it, was a private meeting held inside Windsor Castle after disagreement grew around who should handle sensitive family records connected to the Queen's later wishes. A memorial plan may sound simple, but inside the royal world, it carries deep meaning because it decides who represents memory, who controls access, and who is trusted to protect the dignity of the dead. Elizabeth entered that discussion, hoping for restraint. She found pain instead. Harry pressed hard for equal access to private family records, and his voice carried more than anger. It carried years of feeling pushed outside the circle, years of believing that every closed door proved he was no longer seen as fully part of the family. He wanted fairness, he wanted recognition, he wanted proof that leaving the working royal structure had not stripped him of blood, memory, or belonging. Yet every word he spoke made the Queen listen more carefully, because urgency can become pressure, and pressure can become danger when private royal wishes are involved. William urged caution, and the prince did not match Harry's fire. He stayed controlled, even when the accusation landed hard. Harry challenged him, selfishness, as if silence were another form of control. William could have answered sharply. He could have defended himself with the same force. Instead, he held back, and Elizabeth noticed. The monarch saw not a perfect grandson, but a man who understood that some doors, once opened in anger, could never be closed again. Charles watched the exchange with a father's dread, because he knew both sons were speaking from wounds they had never fully healed. The king understood that Harry was not cruel in that moment. He was hurt, impatient, desperate to be trusted. He also understood that William's stillness was not coldness, it was discipline. Between them sat the Queen, weighing love against duty, family against future, emotion against the terrible need for one steady hand. Then came the point of no return. The next morning, a sealed family phrase known only to a few was repeated outside its intended circle. No public confrontation followed. Elizabeth did not raise her voice. She did not expose the breach. Instead, she acted in the quiet way that made her decisions impossible to dismiss. She wrote a private note naming William alone as the person she trusted to guard the final instruction. That single library conversation became the invisible hand behind everything that followed. Years later, when the executors opened her notes, they were not revealing a sudden choice. They were revealing the consequence of a night when Elizabeth stopped waiting, stopped hoping the tension would settle itself, and chose the grandson she believed could carry silence without turning it into a weapon. But when the past finally resurfaced through Elizabeth's handwriting, it did not stay buried in memory. It erupted into confrontation. The confrontation did not begin with shouting. It began with a closed door, a waiting corridor, and Harry asking for something the palace had already decided he could not have. William arrived without ceremony, his face pale with restraint. Harry looked at him, not as a prince, not as an heir, but as a brother, standing between him and the last private words of their grandmother. Harry had come after learning that the executors would not grant him access to Elizabeth's sealed notes, and every step toward that private corridor carried the same burning question. Why him? Why now? Why had the grandmother who once softened the harshest moments of his life left behind words that made him feel shut out again? The executors, the legal figures responsible for carrying out a person's final wishes, had already made their position clear. The notes were sealed, meaning they were protected from open access, and William had been named as the only family representative authorized to respond. That fact turned a family wound into something harder. It turned pain into procedure. William understood the force of that before he even spoke. The prince had been summoned because Elizabeth's instruction had placed him at the center of the matter, and he knew Harry would not hear authority first. He would hear rejection. He would hear betrayal. Harry asked him directly whether he would personally block him, and the question landed with the force of a blade. It forced William to stop hiding behind the language of executors, notes, and instructions. It forced him to carry the decision in his own voice. William answered quietly, but the quiet made it worse. He said he would obey Elizabeth's note. He said he could not open what she had closed. Harry's expression changed at once, not with surprise, but with the hardening of a man who had just heard his brother choose duty over blood. The prince did not raise his voice, because he knew anger would only make the wound deeper. Harry did not step back, because stepping back would have felt like accepting the humiliation. Harry insisted the note could not mean complete exclusion. He pushed against the wording, against the silence, against the unbearable idea that Elizabeth had made the choice herself. William held the line and repeated the phrase that broke the room. Alone means alone. Those words carried more than refusal. They carried finality. Charles watched from nearby, and the king did not step in. His silence told Harry what no speech could soften. The decision had moved beyond paternal rescue. It was no longer only about paper, grief, or pride. It was about royal control, family trust, and the person Elizabeth had empowered after her death. And behind that painful refusal stood a deeper force, the legal authority that made William's position impossible to challenge. The palace could survive emotion, it could survive anger. What it could not bend was the language of Elizabeth's final private instruction. In a second meeting, the executors placed the note beside the sealed register and explained why William's authority was not symbolic. It was procedural. It was deliberate. And for Harry, it meant the barrier was not personal opinion. It was the Queen's written command. Charles sat through the explanation with a discomfort he could no longer hide, because every sentence seemed to tighten the space around him. The king had heard enough pain from Harry to know this decision would leave a mark, but he also knew enough about the crown to understand why the executors spoke with such certainty. A sealed register, in plain terms, is a protected record used to preserve private royal instructions and decisions that cannot be freely opened or changed by family emotion. That register stayed on the table, unopened to Harry, and its silence carried a brutal message. The matter had moved beyond pleading. It belonged now to process, wording, and the authority Elizabeth had left behind. William lowered his eyes when the executor confirmed what everyone feared. The prince could not reinterpret the note. He could not soften the phrase. He could not turn alone into with discretion, or sole authority into shared understanding. The executor explained that Elizabeth's private instruction gave William complete control over the file, and every decision connected to its disclosure. That meant access, timing, and protection all rested with him. Not because he had taken power, because the Queen had placed it there. Harry was not in that room, yet his absence filled it. Charles could almost hear the question his younger son would ask. Why had no one fought harder? The king wanted to believe there was still a human path through the legal wall, but the deeper the executors went, the more impossible that hope became. They revealed that Elizabeth had revised the wording after the Windsor Library conversation, making clear that the exclusion had not been rushed, emotional, or accidental. She had considered it, she had returned to it, she had sharpened it. William felt the weight of that revelation more than anyone. Success, in that moment, looked like suffering. The prince had been trusted, but trust had made him the face of Harry's humiliation. Then the second line emerged, colder than the first. Elizabeth had warned against divided custodianship, a phrase meaning shared control over one protected responsibility. She feared that if more than one person held access, conflict would follow the file wherever it went. Camilla understood the shift at once. Charles remained trapped between fatherhood and duty. William remained bound by a sentence he could not escape. And with the legal door closed, the emotional fallout began moving through the family faster than anyone could contain. Once the executors finished speaking, the palace was left with the human cost of a decision no one could undo. The first consequence was not public. It was private devastation. Harry returned to his room and removed his jacket, as if the weight of the day had become physical. Charles remained seated long after the meeting ended. William walked alone down a corridor, where every portrait seemed to watch him. Elizabeth's note had settled the question of authority, but it had shattered the illusion of family repair. Harry sat alone with the official wording in front of him, and the pain changed shape. At first, it had been anger, then humiliation. Now it became something quieter and more dangerous. The words did not shout at him, yet they struck harder than any public statement ever could. The note had separated love from trust, and that separation cut deep because it came from Elizabeth, not from a committee, not from a press office, not from an advisor trying to protect the palace. The grandmother he remembered had once softened his storms. The monarch who wrote those instructions had drawn a line he could not cross. William felt no triumph in being on the other side of that line. The prince knew the immediate fallout had begun inside the palace, where aides were told not to discuss the executor decision beyond the necessary circle. That instruction mattered because royal households survive through control. When silence breaks, power begins to leak. Senior household figures soon understood that Harry had not simply been delayed or managed, he had been barred. Offices that usually moved with practiced calm fell into a tense stillness, because everyone sensed that this was more than family pain. It was a rupture wrapped in procedure. Charles found William before the evening had settled, and the king did not try to hide the wound in his voice. He told the prince that Harry had been hurt deeply, perhaps more deeply than anyone in the room had allowed themselves to admit. William listened, but he did not retreat. He told Charles that changing the decision would betray Elizabeth more deeply, because her instruction had been clear, deliberate, and final. The king heard the answer, and looked older under the weight of it. Fatherhood wanted mercy. Duty demanded obedience. Camilla noticed the change at dinner before a single word was spoken. Charles avoided the subject, avoided even Harry's name, and she understood that his grief was no longer private enough to hide. Then came the detail that made the silence heavier. Aides discovered a private annotation beside William's name, a small written warning that suggested Elizabeth had expected resistance. She had not only chosen him, she had prepared him for the storm that would follow. The palace could manage documents, it could manage headlines, it could manage locked rooms and careful statements. But it could not keep two wounded brothers behind walls forever. Someone would have to speak without the shield of lawyers, without the comfort of procedure, and without the distance that had protected them from the truth. And that moment arrives when William and Harry finally face each other without executors, aides, or royal machinery between them. At last, the brothers met without papers on the table. No executors, no courtiers, no fathers standing nearby. Just William and Harry in a quiet room where every old wound had space to breathe. Harry wanted an explanation that felt human. William had only the truth Elizabeth left behind, and for the first time, the argument became less about access and more about loss. Harry spoke first, because silence had already taken too much from him. He asked William whether he had ever fought for him once the executors revealed the note, whether there had been even one moment when the prince had pushed back, questioned the wording, or tried to find a way through it. The question was simple, but it carried years of damage. It was not only about Elizabeth's private instruction anymore. It was about every door that had closed before this one, every conversation that had ended too soon, every time brotherhood had been swallowed by duty. William did not answer quickly. The prince knew that one careless word could turn pain back into fury. He told Harry that the executors had left no room for comfort, because Elizabeth's instruction had named him alone and connected that authority to stewardship. Stewardship, in plain terms, means being trusted to protect something important for someone else, not owning it for personal gain. That distinction mattered, because William was not claiming victory, he was carrying a command. And still, Harry heard the command as rejection. Harry admitted what he had tried to hide behind anger. Being barred felt like being erased from Elizabeth's final circle. It felt as if the grandmother who once understood his loneliness had judged him at the last possible moment and found him unworthy of trust. His voice lost its sharpness then. The fight drained from it. William saw the sadness beneath the accusation, and for the first time, the wound between them seemed less like rebellion and more like grief. William told Harry that being named alone had not comforted him either. It had made him feel the full loneliness of the future crown. The terrible truth that authority often arrives wrapped in someone else's suffering. The prince revealed, through that private conversation, that Elizabeth's instruction was not written to punish Harry. It was written to prevent another family rupture over her private words. She had feared that shared access would turn memory into conflict, and grief into another battlefield. Harry listened, and something inside the anger shifted. He did not forgive everything. He did not suddenly accept the pain as fair, but he began to understand that the Queen's decision was not a rejection of love. It was a judgment about restraint, pressure, and who could guard silence when the family could no longer guard itself. The brothers did not leave that room repaired. Some wounds were too deep for one conversation, and some choices could not be undone by sorrow. But the emotional truth had moved. Rage had given way to something heavier, quieter, and closer to acceptance. Yet outside that private room, the world was already turning Elizabeth's final note into a national reckoning. By morning, the palace silence had broken. Britain woke to the image of two brothers, divided by one final line from the Queen. The story was no longer contained in corridors, executor files, or private grief. It became a national mirror. People did not simply ask who had access to the notes. They asked what Elizabeth had seen, and why she trusted William alone. Harry saw the coverage before the palace could soften its impact, and the wound reopened in a different way. Private pain had become public judgment. What had happened behind closed doors was now being measured by strangers, debated by commentators, and turned into a symbol of everything people believed about his distance from the crown. The palace response had been tightly worded, confirming only that Elizabeth's private instructions were being handled according to her written wishes. Yet that careful phrase carried enormous weight, because it told the world the decision was not temporary, not negotiable, and not driven by palace mood. It was being treated as the late Queen's command. William watched the same coverage in silence, and the prince understood the cruel shape of obedience. To those who supported him, he looked steady, trusted, chosen. To those who pitied Harry, he looked cold, powerful, even ruthless. That was the terrible contrast at the heart of the moment. William had gained authority, but the gain brought no peace. Harry had lost access, but the loss became more than a private disappointment. It became a public mark, a line people could point to and say that Elizabeth herself had drawn it. Charles felt the pressure tighten around the monarchy. The king knew media coverage was not just noise. It shaped the public mood around royal legitimacy, which means the belief that the crown still has moral weight and public trust. If the story turned only into brother against brother, the family would look broken. If it became Elizabeth's final judgment, the institution would look severe. Either path carried risk, and Charles could not escape the fact that both sons were suffering under the same headline. Then came the public image that captured everything. A major newspaper front page showed a black and white image of William and Harry walking apart beneath the headline, "The Queen chose one." It was simple. It was brutal. It turned a private instruction into a national sentence. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered quietly. Some left flowers for Elizabeth. Others debated whether her note had protected the monarchy or condemned one grandson to permanent exclusion. Camilla watched the reaction with unease, understanding that the story had crossed a threshold. The palace could release statements, but it could not control what people felt. William remained the chosen guardian. Harry remained the barred son. And somewhere between sympathy and judgment, Britain began to understand that this was not merely a dispute over papers. And when the noise faded, what remained was not scandal, but the hard emotional meaning of Elizabeth's last act. In the end, Elizabeth's private note did what no speech, summit, or palace compromise could do. It drew a final line. Not because she stopped loving Harry, not because William needed another advantage, but because the monarchy she protected for a lifetime required one trusted hand at the most fragile point of transition. Her choice was painful, precise, and final. Harry understood the verdict in a way anger could no longer disguise. He remained barred from Elizabeth's private instruction, and that word carried the full weight of the ending. Barred meant the door was not waiting to open later. It meant the family had accepted the Queen's final order as permanent. A private instruction, in simple terms, is a written direction left to guide trusted people after someone's death, and this one had become more than a document. It had become a line between love and trust. Harry was left with grief, not triumph, not revenge, not even a clear enemy he could confront. The person who had drawn the line was the grandmother he still mourned. William accepted the burden with quiet resolve, but the prince did not mistake authority for peace. Elizabeth's note confirmed him as the sole guardian of the sealed matter, and a guardian means the person trusted to protect something important and make sure it is not misused. That role strengthened his position inside the monarchy, yet it also deepened the wound between brothers. He had been chosen, but the choice had cost him. He carried success like sorrow, because every step into responsibility pushed Harry farther outside the circle they once shared. Charles saw the deeper meaning only after the noise began to fade. The king understood that Elizabeth had not written to punish the past. She had written to protect the future from being torn open again. The monarchy accepted the decision internally and procedurally, meaning the matter was closed inside the royal system and would not be reopened through emotion, pressure, or appeal. Charles could grieve for Harry and still recognize the force of the Queen's judgment. He could feel the pain as a father and still obey it as monarch. The sealed notes remained guarded, but their message had already reshaped the family. William was the chosen steward. Harry was the excluded witness. Elizabeth's handwriting ended the argument more powerfully than any speech could have done, because it carried the voice of a monarch who knew exactly what division could do to a crown. This became one of the defining emotional breaks of the modern monarchy. The day her final trust confirmed William's role and left Harry outside a door that would not open again. There is no further door to unlock, no hidden appeal waiting in the shadows. Only the lasting truth that Elizabeth's final instruction changed the family, crowned William with responsibility, and left Harry to face the cost of being barred from her last private trust. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.